I'm slowly becoming one of those guys who films himself in public. I'm not sure if TikTok is a good thing for me or not. But anyway, prayer should not be content. What I mean by that is if you're recording something like a prayer for someone to algorithmically find later that you don't know, what you're doing is you're turning your prayer into content. Or if you're live streaming prayers you're saying about people or prayers you're making for people, well, then you're making content out of that prayer. The reason that falls short is kind of twofold. The first fold is it mistakes the internet for a place. And we've talked about that. The internet is a thing. It is not a place. And if we treat it like a place, it becomes the biggest place that we could possibly conceive of. You know, every social media site has the ability to connect to all nations at the same time. So the internet becomes this huge kind of place. When we take that view of the internet, what prayer then becomes is the biggest place where we can pray. And Christ admonishes us not to do this kind of thing. He says, when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites who stand on the street corners and with their loud voice think that they will be heard. You can't have a louder voice than TikTok right now. But if and when prayer on the internet isn't a place or isn't something that we do on the place of the internet, but rather we do something to the thing of the internet, well, then it becomes something entirely different. When we make prayer content on the internet, what we end up doing is taking what should be something said between people to God or said between God and yourself, and we turn it into a thing. We turn it into a digital file. And that really only comes into play as a bad thing when we consider what that means with our in-person prayers, the ones we make, when we algorithmically find a prayer that has been made into content that we then adopt. What's happening in that interaction? What's happening when you find a piece of content, algorithmically or otherwise, and you take that prayer and you make it yours because you've decided that this belongs to me now because it was made, obviously, for me because I found it with the algorithm. Because prayer as content can do very well as content. The nature of what's happening when people are trying to pray has to be reconciled with. You see, when we decide to use that prayer instead of making a prayer ourselves, what we're doing is we're deciding that our communication with God is going to take a sidestep to what is really a device, what is really a creation of mankind to stand in the place of that prayer. And that's a very troubling kind of modern magic that's happening. It's almost like the process of making a talisman, if you know anything about that. What talismans are is they are usually a piece of jewelry or something expensive, like a smartphone, that is imbued with magical power. And that's what's happening when we try to make prayer content. There's this aspect of us trying to take what we want the prayer to do and putting it onto something to lay in wait for someone who's going to need that prayer that we have put into that device or that file or that piece of jewelry or that smartphone. We want it to kind of rest there until the algorithm finds the person who's going to use it. That's what's happening when you make prayer into content, into like recorded content so that people can find it later or find it, repeatedly so that they can come back to the prayer over and over and over and over, depending on what they're trying to get out of the prayer. And I think that's a deeply flawed view of what prayer is supposed to be, because it's no longer communication between you and God. It's, instructions engraved digitally onto something so that you can have that communicate, with God instead of you. And that's a very flawed view of what prayer actually is. Think of it this way. Prayer is communication. And so when you make it into content, you can get, views galore out of, your prayer. You get 100,000 views for, a rightly worded prayer about, a vague enough person that it could apply to 100,000 people. That doesn't necessarily mean that that prayer is for that 100,000 people, but it could definitely get those views. Does that make it more sincere than a prayer made by any one of those 100,000 people for those same reasons? If it's a prayer for, healing, and the person is looking for the power of God to heal them, and they pray for it and don't receive the healing, and then they try to use this talisman that's been created, this digital prayer talisman that is prayer in content, for that same purpose. What are they doing except for ceasing communication with God about their healing, and then deciding that this thing is going to be the key, that this is going to be the way that I get my healing, as opposed to the communication with God about that healing. And you can do that about supplication, about mercy, about justice, about anything that you would normally do prayer for. Another way to think of it is, could you record yourself praying and have that recording serve in place of you doing the praying, in lieu of social media altogether? And could you do that for someone else? Could you record a prayer, load it onto your iPod, make sure your iPod's plugged in, and press repeat, and just have that prayer going nonstop 24/7, 365? Would that mean you're praying all the time? A lot of Christian creators will make prayer content because they've got a faulty theology of what the internet is in the first place. They view it as a place, a magical, no pun intended, place where they can be connected to all sorts of people who need prayer. But instead, what they end up doing is turning their prayers into a magical object, into a magical thing, a talisman, something that they can pour the intent of their prayers into so that somebody else can find that. And whether they know that's happening or not is quite besides the point. The same way, whether they know that a prayer recorded into an iPod and pressed repeat on would be effectual or not is besides the point. Prayer is meant to be communication, and anytime we take it away from that context, it becomes problematic and becomes something that can be so much worse than the intent of the prayers. It becomes this thing that turns pagan, that turns into a magical practice, because it's leaving its initial and original function as communication between you and God, or between you and God on the behalf of someone else. Prayer can't be content. It can't be content for the same reason that worship can't be content. You couldn't record yourself singing every song that your church sings and just asking the sound team to play that recording alongside the music that's happening on Sundays whenever they need another voice to add to the mix. That wouldn't be you worshiping. That would be a talisman of your voice trying to worship and failing. This isn't to say that prayer doesn't have a place on the internet. It just doesn't have a place on the internet as content. We'll do a part 2 and explain how prayer actually works on the internet and how it can be one of the most Christian things that you do.